Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. G'day and welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh coming to you here from Auckland in New Zealand. And this week I'm on my own while Zach is still away on a well-earned break and the rest of the team are also busy. But I am very pleased to bring you this week an interview that I had with Luke Middleton from Melbourne, Australia. And he's got some stunning designs for you to have a look at. We'll put some links in the show notes so you can have a look. I'm really interested in the evolution of architecture, modern contemporary architecture that's also sustainable and designed specifically for warm environments, and that's something that Luke, I think, does really, really well. All right, but before we get into that, I just want to do a quick shout out to the sponsors and supporters of the Passive House Accelerator. And they are the founding sponsors: 475 High Performance Building Supply, Bax Ingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass, Minotaur All-in-One HVAC, Mitsubishi Electric Heating and Air Conditioning, Partel, Rockwool, Stowe and Zola Windows, and the stakeholder partner for the Passive House Accelerator is NYSERDA. Thank you to all those great supporters and more. You can check those out at passivehouseaccelerator.com/sponsors. And if you want to join them to support the work that goes on there, then please get in touch. Send Zach and the team an email, hello@passivehouseaccelerator.com. And if you want to get in touch with us here at the podcast, then you can message us just at podcast@passivehouseaccelerator.com. We'd love to hear from you. All right, well, let's get into this week's interview. As I said, Luke Middleton is a award-winning architect and passive house designer. He's based in Melbourne, and he draws on some early experience and inspiration from a brief period in London, but also spending a bit of time in Europe and Czechoslovakia at the time. Now he has almost 2 decades of experience where he's been creating community, educational and residential buildings in Australia. And he is, like I said, one of a growing number of Australian designers that are exploring and evolving contemporary sustainable architecture for the Southern Hemisphere, really, and warm climates. So I hope you enjoy this chat. I'll talk to you after. Well, let's start off with a bit about where you're based.
That's right. Yeah. We're in Melbourne, north side. Northcote is where I live, and my office is in Collingwood.
We've got a few people from all around the world. Give us a quick overview of the climate in your part of the world.
It's called sort of warm temperate, and there's little microclimates all around. So actually in Northcote, it's probably winters, well, the other day it was 0 and the top temperature was 10 degrees. And in summer, we could get the lowest temperature of 30 degrees with a top temperature of 44 degrees. So it varies from season to season.
And the typical housing stock around where you are?
We're in sort of probably ranging between 300 and 500 square metre blocks in Northcote. So detached housing intermingled with medium and a little smattering of higher density, maybe 6 to 7, 8-story stuff. In Collingwood, where our office is, it's far more dense. There's a lot of lot of 6 to 12 story apartments, and the densification is happening because we are quite close to the city. From the CBD, I can get to the CBD from here in about 12 minutes on the bike.
And some of those, I imagine around Collingwood, there'd be some houses that are getting a bit old now. What sort of ages are we talking for some of the original houses in that region?
Yeah, well, it's a workers' area, so there's a lot of workers' cottages, at least 100 years old.
Yeah.
And same in Northcote. Northcote's probably a little bit newer, but there is. I mean, our street is heritage listed, so our neighbours are all Californian bungalows and sort of small small versions of a, what would you call it, like a Victorian cottage.
Yeah. How did you get into architecture in the first place?
Oh, in a very roundabout way. I studied building first with the idea of moving into architecture. Did a bit of work over in Europe for a while as a project manager, and then came back to Australia and sort of decided that I liked building and project management, but I liked architecture more, and I liked the creating. And so I then studied architecture and moved into design. And that was that was about 20 something years ago.
Whereabouts in Europe were you?
I started in London, finished my degree in London at London University, and don't ask me where I lived there because there was 10 places. We don't have time, but I think, and then I moved to Czechoslovakia and lived in Prague for about 9 months.
Right. And has that influenced, or did that influence your architecture work? That time spent in Europe and around the buildings that you experienced there?
Yes, it did. I mean, I think that it was a sort of wake-up call for me as a person as well. It's quite interesting, sort of obviously Australia is the lucky country, and there was a wake-up call in terms of that. But in terms of the architecture, I would say yes, in that you understand that people live in much more compact spaces, especially when you travel to places like Amsterdam, and then go, well, they're one of the biggest race on the world, and they've got the much smaller houses than we do in Australia.
Yeah. I've just come back from Australia and always reminded flying into one of the cities there just how spread out a lot of Australian cities are. There's just definitely a lot of sprawl going on, a lot of single-story houses, a lot of inefficient use of space. But I think that's starting to change with some redevelopment and densification, particularly in the city centres, which is an interesting challenge and an opportunity for people in your line of work. When did you first come across Passive House?
Passive House I came across through a client back in around about 2014, maybe 15, sorry. And so a client approached us and said, I like your work, Luke. You're not passive certified, but I like your work. And what about working together with us and a passive consultant?
What was it that in particular that drew them to you? What did they like about the work that you'd done up to that point?
I think they liked the fact that my designs were very responsive to the site already. So I think that there was a natural progression from our architectural process, which sort of we try to combine the idea that if you start with the proper DNA and listen to the site, then you're going to get a good scientific outcome. And then if you can overlay that with the poetry of architecture, then you're going to get a great outcome that is not only obviously scientifically works, but it also has the poetry that good architecture does.
What does that mean, the respecting the location, the designing for the site and sort of in harmony and poetry with that? What does that mean in practical terms?
That means really understanding your context. So that'd be looking at the for example, on an urban site, you're going to have a lot of things overshadowing you. So there's no point putting in north-facing windows that are going to be overshadowed by your neighbour.
Mm-hmm.
It looks at how the social fabric of the street works. How does the houses interact with the street? Then you can then determine how the landscape can interact with the street and the house, because obviously the landscape can be very beneficial to the performance of a building if handled correctly. So they're just a few examples. I mean, obviously, there's the classic things like cross ventilation, good insulation, and then obviously those overlays that the passive house bring to it, such as the thermal bridging. But before I did passive house or researched it, it was interesting that the lack of knowledge. I put my hand up and say lack of knowledge about the importance of thermal bridges and the like.
But you were thinking about sustainability in general. You've incorporated things like rainwater collection and reuse in the buildings. You've talked already about the social aspect of buildings. Were they things that you were taught as an architect, or are they more values of that you have as a person?
Probably more values. I think that's one of the things that I would like to see change is a bit more focus and a lens of sustainability within the architectural education and industry. So yeah, most of that probably was actually some of it was brought out of frustration. In fact, Matthew, one year I actually specified a water tank, and the client pulled it out to put a second oven in their house. And I was horrified at this.
Was that a gas oven?
It was actually electric, but
right.
they had a gas hot plate. Don't you worry.
Right.
They had gas heating. But the client that actually I tried to take my rage and turn it into a positive, and actually then set up this joint venture with the Victorian government at the time with the Smart Water Fund, and we put together 5 case studies to show how integrating water recycling into your home through rainwater storage back in 2005 can be very, very cost effective and can give you obviously this reassurance that when there's water restrictions, you can still water your garden. So long story short is sometimes I've managed to take my rage and turn it into a positive. It's not always possible.
It's a very positive outlet to try and create a useful resource. And you've been involved with other projects since then with universities. You've been involved in. Have you done stuff with the ATA, the Alternate Technology Association Australia?
Yep. Yeah, I've done work with the ATA. We do the open days with the ATA for Sustainable House Day. We've been involved in Sustainable House Day with our projects dating back to 2005. We've also worked with Melbourne University since 2007, doing research into comparing actual performance against predicted performance, and obviously therefore scrutinizing the rating tools. And we believe that's really one of the Achilles heels in the whole built environment. We do not have as built performance. There isn't this, what is the actual situation when you get to the end of the day for a home, or whether it's a home or a school building. It's all theoretical performance at the moment.
So those comparisons that you've done, what's the energy modelling that you've used as the baseline?
It's changed over the years. So, initially we were just comparing the typical first-rate system. So in 2007, with a building we did in Mildura, which had some systems that were very hard to model. It had like a heat purging system with a culvert, underground culvert to mediate the soil, using the soil temperature to mediate the air. And we compared what first rate would say, and then we actually used, now you've caught me, there was a modelling software on thermodynamics, and it's jumped out of my head, but we did have a chap, I can come back to you on that actually modelled it, and then we compared the actual results. So we had 20 thermostats throughout the house and did it over a course of 2 years, and found that the house outperformed the predicted performance. And we compared it to another house that was rated similar by a company I won't mention, because obviously it's probably not good for me to mention it, but it was a volume builder, and the performances were chalk and cheese, and that was one of the things that we wanted to. Well, we sort of didn't set out to sort of poo-poo them. We just set out to actually just see where everything stood and show, I suppose, that there are limits to theoretical modelling.
Right. So first rate, for those that haven't heard of it, that's a front end to the accurate calculation engine, isn't it? For
Yeah, in
that's
principle,
used.
that's right. Yeah,
Yes.
so it looks mainly at the building envelope, and it doesn't factor in a lot of things that Passive House does, though. So it's just a very simplified version.
Does it do infiltration, or is it mostly conductive
I
losses?
think it's bringing in more infiltration.
Right.
I'm not an expert in the field, but and we deliberately haven't become raters because we like the independence.
Yeah. Right. And an accurate model is that required now across Australia for a NatHERS, the National Home Energy Rating Scheme at point of sale? How does that work?
It's not required at point of sale yet. I think Canberra is going to be the first to introduce that. I think we're a bit laggards in Australia, in Melbourne.
Right, right. But the point of your research and your findings is that the actual performance doesn't necessarily stack up all that great with those more basic models anyway.
Yeah, and I think that that's one of the really big problems in that when I talk about performance, it shouldn't just be the thermal performance. It should be obviously the energy consumption, the water consumption, and then I think the other performance measures are obviously usability, happiness, all those other things
Yeah,
that ultimately are a missing point. I think that if you think about other big ticket items in our lives, whether they're a fantastic holiday overseas or a car, they've all got very, very detailed as-built performance reviews.
yeah,
And the house doesn't. And I think that there's an endemic problem because of the fact that obviously we have commodified housing
yeah.
and buildings, and therefore the problem is that the disclosure is less likely to happen from the person that's the occupier or the purchaser, because obviously they don't want to devalue their asset.
Mm.
And it's not likely to be disclosed by someone who's not doing something sustainable because it downgrades their not their credibility, but their ability to purport that they're very sustainable. So it's not very transparent.
Yeah, yeah. You've mentioned lots of different aspects beyond just the thermal performance, and I agree. I think one of the big areas that we lack measuring at the moment is fresh air supply, because that relates to the health of the building. That's one thing that I think is a really strong point of Passive House. From a technical point of view, what is systems thinking from your perspective, and how does that relate to overall sustainability?
Well, systems thinking, I suppose, is make sure things aren't sort of adjudicated or worked out in silos. It's sort of this idea that there is overlap in everything. So if you think about it, without post occupancy monitoring, we can't have a feedback loop into the systems thinking that improves the design or picks up flaws in your theoretical design. Secondly, systems thinking thinks about it can also then layer in things like adaptability, and therefore when you're designing, you're not just saying, oh, here's a beautiful layout and this is the way this family wants to live, or this client wants to live in their commercial building. You're thinking about how well the building, without starting afresh, can adapt in the future. So systems thinking is about layering complex problems which exist. I mean, just like nature, there's a whole layer of things that need to symbiotically work together. And when that symbiosis happens, you start to get exponential jumps in your sustainable outcomes, because you're not having to put more embodied energy into a building within the first 10 years because it's so adaptable. And so systems thinking thinks at those multiple layers.
And how well would you say the training for architects and builders in Australia grapples with those concepts?
It's getting better, but I think that there is still a big way to go, because it's really just coming back to, yeah, I mean, it's a very philosophical thing. I was trying to work out how you would explain it, but it's sort of like we're a bit upside down at the moment because we're such an image-based society.
Yeah.
So whether you're a builder, whether you're a client, whether you're a university lecturer, there is such a sort of topsy-turvy lean-to towards how does this look in a photograph, and how does
Yeah.
it sort of come across, as opposed to how does it how is it to live in, and how is it to, what happens when the seasons change, and those sorts of things. So I think the yardstick or the measuring of success in a design is got to be really rethought, and that's going to take time.
Yeah, I love the fact that on your website you've got some stunning images, which certainly are useful to attract people to the work you do. But you've also got a whole bunch of data and graphs and statistics about how some of the buildings have performed, so people can dive into some of that real information that's coming out of buildings, and looking at the indoor and outdoor temperature, and just how things are going. I agree that it is hard to sell an image of health and comfort, because how do you take a photo of that?
Yeah, it's really difficult, and that's sort of why we try to use my own home, which is built to the principles of a passive house and performs extremely well. When we bring them here, they sort of start to get it,
Yeah,
and they start to get the fact that we try to, I suppose, use layering to make small spaces feel bigger, and make big spaces feel even more generous and flexible, and to explain to them how we've thought ahead, that what in down the track, when my kids get older, well, we can change the layout of this house with very little intervention. I can get a carpenter to come for a few days and put in a few new walls, because we've already made provisions for doors in walls where we would change the layout, and we haven't got sort of oodles of corridors. So I think
right,
that's another thing that's really interesting, is about sustainability, is about being, and I get excited about it, is about just being super efficient with space.
right. So efficiency of um, the the geometry, as well as efficiency, energy, and use of resources.
Yeah.
What are some of the big objections when you talk about passive house to people, particularly in your part of the world?
I think that there still is a little bit of preconception that it came out of Europe, and therefore it's not applicable to our environment. I try to shut that down with my knowledge that obviously they've done projects in very humid climates, and they've done them in similar climates to Melbourne. So I try to explain that the science doesn't lie. Unless you're Donald Trump, so I'm not sure if that was very timely, but but yeah, there is that's one thing that I say. I think the other thing is that they do believe that, yeah, you've got these big chunky windows. I think that can sometimes be a bit, but again, by showing them how to use um, the windows in a clever way, and to show them that you don't need to build, I suppose, a typical European style passive house. We call it passive hybrid, just to try and break the barrier down and say, well, this is actually an Australian passive solar house with passive design principles built into it. And so therefore, when it's a good day, you can open it up just like an Aussie house, and have your Aussie barbecue, and have your everything like that. And it can do the cross ventilation, because it needs to do that. That's one thing that people are really worried about in Melbourne, especially, is the overheating of a passive house.
Right. So the overheating more than feeling like they are closed in and can't open the window, or is it a bit of both?
Bit of both. I'd say it's a bit of both. Yeah, I think it's just that idea that you see a passive house, and it's the sort of typical extruded gable with two-story and small windows,
Yeah.
and a basement. So we try to, break that trend, and as you say, that's why we are so. Um, we try to make sure that people understand that the pictures that they see on our site are the actual shape, and the geometries are derived out of the site analysis. So that's why I believe, a lot of people think that sustainability is a constraint on your creativity, and I think the opposite. I think, in fact, anyone can go, whoa, whoa, whoopee do, I want to make something that, the shape of a rabbit, and then they make one in the shape of the rabbit and extrude it out, and they're my concrete rabbit, and I've got glass at either end, and look how cool I am. And I go, well, that's great. That's a, one liner. Whereas with a passive house or a sustainable house that orientates itself well and deals with overshadowing and all the trials and tribulations of the Melbourne climate, you have to actually try and create the beauty with all this functionality.
What do you think the Australian passive house looks like?
Oh, it varies. It looks how it should be. I believe a little bit like Louis Kahn. The what did you do? He asked the brick what it should be. I don't quite ask the brick what it should be. I don't use brick that much, but I do. I try to ask the site. I've done a permaculture certificate, and a big thing on permaculture, which people probably don't realise, is that it's not just about garden design. It's a whole it's a whole philosophy in the idea that if you can minimize atrophy and the losses in systems, then you are going to improve sustainable outcomes in people's lives, engagement as well, because obviously you're engaging with the garden. But so they're all about, also within their design, like my homes, is, well, if you want something every day, put it in a really useful spot. So they actually taught me, they said, you can have a little tiny workshop inside your house, because if you do have your screwdriver and a few key tools, you're likely to fix something that's half broken rather than throw it out.
Yeah.
And so they're all about this thing. So I suppose, coming back to what you're asking, is that there is an analysis process and a looking and learning about the site and learning about the local culture as much as you can. Now, that's probably impossible when you do an overseas project fully, but in terms of what I would do, I sometimes really try to understand the site both in a technical manner, so you'd understand the data of the climate, the winds, the prevailing things, the microclimate. Then you'd look at just the ambience of the site, and you'd then look at the trees and the existing foliage. You might look at what it was like 50 years ago, and sort of understand all of those layers, and then start to map out how the building might sit.
I'm trying to look for some common themes in your portfolio, and it's challenging in a really positive way because you've got so much variety in there of different styles, from very contemporary through to quite classic buildings and retrofits and renovations that you've done. One thing I'd have to say that is common, that's just struck me, is quite large roofs, but in a good way, that are there, that look very functional as well as aesthetically pleasing. Obviously, shade's a big thing in Australia, but I'm really excited to see that vernacular that's emerging of contemporary Australian design that is breaking away from traditional cottage with a pergola, veranda around the edges. Can still have that, but I really love, and I'll send a link so people can have a look. But how do you? Is that something that you think of consciously regarding shading, or is that just a result of that process that you've described about thinking about the site?
Well, I think there's a combination there. Often the roof form might be derived, like in our own house, we've got a heritage overlay in the area, and I was inspired by the Californian bungalows, but then that gable becomes morphed to work with the sun. So your answer, there's two parts to that answer. One is the shape starts because of the context, and then it ends in its morphed existence because of the solar aspects. And then other things are sometimes, driven by the client. So we try to be very, very open-minded with our clients. And if they say, well, look, we like a flat roof house. We don't get many of them, as you see, but we would certainly bring that on board. And obviously, if we've got a higher density, we'd start to bring in flat roof, because then you can obviously have a green space on the top and the like. But I think, as you say, the idea of vernacular, and I remember studying architecture, and Kenneth Frampton's got a book called Critical Regionalism, or he terms a phrase called critical regionalism, and that actually really struck a chord with me, because I sat in lectures and I'm thinking, everyone's talking about how the architects are sort of getting into their own work, and no one's really talking about how the users are getting into the architect's finished building. And I was just sort of a bit disillusioned by that sort of echo chamber. And whereas critical regionalism sort of says, well, let's take the best bits of what internationalism brought with us, but learn from how the farmers did it, learn from utility, learn from invention by necessity.
Yeah. Great stuff. You got a few actual passive house projects on the go at the moment. Obviously been a bit of a challenge, and I think that's the story of the journey that Australia is going on, getting people. That sort of ripple effect takes a few projects, and then the momentum starting to build up, which is great. But you've got a couple on the go at the moment, including an Enefit project.
That's right. Yeah, that's a heritage overlay renovation. So we've designed a house just around the corner from here, and the clients are really committed to getting effectively the renovation bit is a separate pod which has been airlocked off from the other part of the house, so it will actually perform as a passive house performance level. It's Enefit because we have to obviously combine the two in terms of the way the rating system works. So. That one, we were restricted because of the heritage overlay, but it is, it's a terrific one, and it just again shows when you've got a client, even with a heritage overlay, you can do it. We've done another heritage house which didn't quite make Enefit, but again, the lucky thing about that is that the client's so committed. He's disseminating all the information about his house, the performance, the thermal, he's got right into it. He's got checking the temperature differential from the top of the ceiling to the bottom of the ceiling. I think he's got no less than 30 sensors in the house. And we've got some of his sensors in our house, which is great because we can test the CO2 levels. We can test we don't test it. It's tested. Yeah. It's tested every 15 minutes. We can't hide from it. It's got particulate matter. It's got the works.
Yeah. Oh, that's good stuff. I can't help thinking that it is going to continue to ripple out with the work that you're doing, and having people like that spreading the word is awesome as well, because people will jump into that and get even more enthusiastic about it and see the results from that work.
I think it would be really good in the future that there was some regulations brought in to ensure that the correct messages were going out to the public and to the industry bodies. And maybe one way would be to sort of anything that was a high profile project or that won an award was offered the potential to do this analysis and actually test the as-built performance, because without as-built performance, we're all just relying on hearsay. And then if you did that, you get a lot of leverage. I think that's because I think that at the moment we've got this sort of incremental change in Australia, and that incremental change is not fast enough because you've got, interested parties that don't want too much change, and you've got people sort of in the echo chambers gradually changing, but only very slowly. But if all of a sudden you turn the industry upside down and said, well, anyone that claims to be sustainable, you can do that, no problem, but just give us a few of your results for a year or so, and no problem, So, and that the good thing about that is that the really sustainable people would bubble to the surface, and the other people might stay quiet, or they might fall flat on their face, or they might change their design principles. Because I think you can't. This bolt-on sustainability still seems to be happening. This idea that I designed this beautiful-looking structure, floor-to-ceiling glass and whatever else, and I get the engineer to fix it.
Stick some solar panels on the roof.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Just
Yeah.
exactly. And I think that, as you would know, with passive house, it's about actually having the fit house, and the panels are just the cream on the just they're just the cherry. They're just the last little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have this analogy with bike riding. A lot of people go out and spend a truckload on a fancy bike, but they're not very fit.
Yeah.
And I think just start with a reasonable bike
Yeah.
and then get fit, and then you don't need the $20,000 bike. You've got to have the fit engine. And I think a house is the same. Get the house or the building, whether it's a school building or office building, get the fundamentals right. Don't rely on the technological fix. Save and except for the heat recovery unit, because that's a very good bit of technological,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's part of a system as opposed to one component. I think
Yeah.
that's the difference.
Yeah. Nice. Oh, very good. Hey, well, thank you for your time, Luke, and for all your inspiration. I'll definitely be directing people to your site. Is that the best place for people to see what you're up to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that just go to the EME site and check it out. And if they've got any questions or want any more, I can send them to the some of our papers that we've published.
Great.
They're with what is it, the Springer Group. I think
yeah,
they do all those academic sort of publications.
Awesome.
That's one of them. Because I think the more people, I mean, that's about sustainability, is about being not holding your information. The whole idea of IP, I think, makes things slower to move. So I think we need to try and be really open.
Luke Middleton there, coming to you from Melbourne, Australia. And do check out Luke's website. It's emedesign.com.au. And you'll see what I mean about the aesthetic of some of the projects that Luke's designed. I really like the idea of big roofs, and in the past I've definitely been a fan of a decent pitch on a roof. I think a flat roofs can be a little bit problematic, but they don't have to be that way, and flat roofs can be done well. But I think the main concepts that Luke embodies really well is that of shading and good eaves, not necessarily in the traditional sense either. He's got some really great contemporary lines there, and lots of variety, but all quite stunning. So check that out, emedesign.com.au. I guess the other thing from that interview that struck me is the ongoing challenge of convincing people to go all the way to Passive House. And a lot of the inspiration tends to come from clients, particularly early on in architects' journey towards Passive House. It is often has been the case when we've spoken to architects, an educated client or a passionate client who is the first time that a designer might get to work on a Passive House, because that's the brief they get from a client who's gone and done their research and found that that's what they want to do and have commissioned something along those lines. And often it does snowball from there. It's a bit of a ripple effect to get one project certified, and it creates a bit of a talking point, and then other people see it and then decide that that's something that they would like to have. Funny that they would like to have a warm, dry, comfortable home. And that's where things really start to pick up, because then once people experience that, particularly coming and visiting one, that's when things can really escalate from there. So, hope you enjoyed that. We'll have more interviews coming up. Zach's still away for a little bit on his well-earned break, but we've got another couple of episodes coming up soon, and looking forward to approaching episode number 100, which is pretty exciting for the Passive House podcast. Do stay in touch. You can check out all the events and activities coming up over at passivehouseaccelerator.com. And if you haven't already, make sure you sign up for the newsletter there so you get all that information, as well as links to all the great articles and replays of videos and other events, that huge amount of resources that are on that site for yourself. And also, if you want to share it with others, like potential clients, there's some fantastic Passive House resources there that you can use. That's it for this week. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh. Thank you very much for listening in, and we'll be back again next week on the Passive House Podcast.